I think there were three efforts that were put into place, policy efforts to segregate schools and communities in Kansas City. The first was the massive displacement caused by urban renewal activities and building of highways in the 1950s and 60s. Highway building and urban renewal displacement activities funneled a huge number of people into the housing market that was unprecedented at the time. But there was no other huge expansion of people into the housing market before that time nor after that time either. Thousands and thousands of people were displaced each year from in the 50s and 60s. The segregative relocation practices of the Urban Renewal Agency, the Land Clearance for Redevelopment Authority, as well as the Missouri Department of Highways and Transportation were well documented by both those organizations as well as civil rights organizations too. The second major factor, or major effort in the development of residential segregation was the efforts of the Kansas City, Missouri School District, whose officials implemented discriminatory school attendance boundary zone changes in the period after 1954. School attendance boundary changes occurred multiple times in neighborhoods east and west of Troost Avenue along the north-south gradient. But the east-west boundary did not change hardly at all. It was basically channeled along Troost Avenue. And so at the same time you have a huge number of people being displaced and funneled into the housing market through urban renewal and highway relocation practices, you have the school board basically maintaining the segregated nature of schools by drawing school attendance boundaries down Troost Avenue. And this lasted until the middle of the 1970s. Third factor, school attendance boundaries help set in motion a process of wide-scale real estate block busting. And block busting is a real estate practice in which a real estate agent or firm will attempt to relocate an African-American family or African-American homeowner into an all-white neighborhood for purposes of exploiting white fears of impending racial turnover and property devaluation to then buy up the properties at depressed prices and then sell them back at inflated prices to the African-American homeowner, thus in the process generating a huge profit to the typically victimizing and exploitive transaction. So those three factors had reinforcing effects. Highway displacement and urban renewal activities set in motion a huge wave of people looking for housing within Kansas City. Schools' attendance boundary lines basically communicated to people that the schools east of Troost Avenue would be confined to the expanding African American population. They're contributing to overcrowding as well as overcrowding in schools east of Troost Avenue and underutilization of schools west of Troost Avenue. The use of Troost Avenue as a school attendance boundary decision in turn helped set in motion large-scale real estate block busting. And block busting had been taking place decades before the 1950s and even takes place to a lesser extent today. However, it only took place on large scale in the 50s and 60s through the early 70s due to the actions of the Kansas City, Missouri School District. There were several ways in which communities responded to these efforts. One response was disruptive protest. There was much mobilization by civil rights activists. Freedom Incorporated was playing a major role. They emerged in 1965 as a formidable civil rights organization in the city. There was much lobbying before the school district, protests at school district board meetings, passage of Fair Housing Ordinance in 1967, passage of a city council ordinance in 1964 outlawing block busting. Those were some of the efforts that the community engaged in to resist the kinds of racial transformation of neighborhoods. I think there were three different attitudes regarding school desegregation in the period after 1954, and these were not rigid distinctions. I think there was on the one hand, there was some people who just felt neutral about it. On the other hand, there were others that viewed it with disdain. School desegregation was something to be deeply resisted. And And so there was a great deal of real estate activity seeking to resist school desegregation, as well as especially efforts to eliminate racial discrimination within housing markets. And then finally, there were those civil rights organizations that mobilized to really push for the changes, and recognizing that pro-integration factors could be a major push to develop more equitable and democratic communities in the city of Kansas City. So segregation produced a number of different outcomes for communities, both economic outcomes as well as racial outcomes too. And so in some communities, especially neighborhoods east of Troost Avenue, as the neighborhoods underwent racial transition, there was widespread disinvestment of these neighborhoods, redlining of these neighborhoods. So it really wasn't the racial transition that was important. It was what happened after the racial transition, or what happened concurrently with the racial transition. And so the school district, there are two factors here. The school district itself stopped investing in the physical upkeep and maintenance of schools east of Troost Avenue. There was overcrowding in schools east of Troost Avenue, combined with the redlining of banks and other financial institutions. This basically set in motion a long process of urban decay in those neighborhoods east of Troost Avenue. And so the key thing here is that it's not racial transition that's the problem. It's what occurs, it's the institutional reaction to racial transition. So just because a neighborhood is undergoing a transition from white to Hispanic, or white to African American, or white to Asian, that shouldn't even be an issue or defined as a problem. The problem occurs, or is typically defined as a problem, is when the financial institutions disinvest in those communities as a result of the racial transition of those communities. And that kind of decision is wrapped into feelings and notions and perceptions that race is a problem when it comes to neighborhoods. There's several ways in which the communities have been reshaped in over the years as a result of segregation and uneven development. We can think of schools themselves have undergone a process of transformation. We can think about and consider the uneven development of schools west of Troost Avenue as contrasted to east of Troost Avenue. We can look on a metropolitan scale and recognize that the fiscal disparities between the central cities and the suburban cities is very striking, and those fiscal disparities both reflect and reinforce racial residential segregation. So in cities such as Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri, that have a less affluent tax base, that means less money for them to fund public resources, less money for parks, recreation, less money to fix up roads, less money for schools, less money to use as incentives to try to attract businesses to those particular areas. Whereas when we look at the suburban areas that have a more affluent property tax base, that means that those areas have more money to extract from the property tax base to fund roads, to fund parks, recreation, to fund schools. Therefore, these fiscal disparities between cities and suburbs both reflect and reinforce class residential segregation, but also racial residential segregation too. I think there are several changes that we could implement, or at least consider, that would improve urban communities in Kansas City today. The first would be to recognize that it's not enough just to talk about the harms of residential segregation or conduct studies that show us the causes of residential segregation over time. It's important to do both of those, but also to, at the same time, consider and debate what kinds of solutions that we would have or could at least implement to deal with those problems. And solutions can manifest themselves at the local level, at the state level, or at the federal level too. And there's a great deal of conflict and struggle over, what can we do as citizens to implement beneficial changes and progressive changes to undo the patterns of segregation. I think it's important to recognize that there's a complicated relationship between discrimination and segregation. For many, many years, people believe that discrimination is a major causal factor in residential segregation, and it is a major factor. However, it's not the only factor either. There are other factors that contribute with racial discrimination to reinforce and perpetuate residential segregation. And so I think it's important to embrace holistic and comprehensive understandings that recognize the nuance of residential segregation. It's not just racism or racial discrimination that's the sole cause of residential segregation. I think another factor that we could take into account would be, while fair housing laws and anti-discrimination statutes can be effective measures to address racial discrimination in housing markets, they're not necessarily panaceas for remedying the negative effects of residential segregation. So that's an important distinction. Fair housing laws and anti-discrimination statutes address discrimination. They don't necessarily address segregation. And so it's important to keep using fair housing laws and anti-discrimination statutes to attack discrimination in the housing market. But we also have to recognize that fair housing laws and anti-discrimination statutes tend to be reactive. They respond to allegations of discrimination in the housing market, but they don't necessarily address the institutional foundations and the institutional segregationist practices of the real estate sector and housing markets that are responsible for the maintenance of residential segregation. And I think another factor we might consider would be looking at the metropolitan level, considering the implementation of metropolitan-wide housing authorities, metropolitan school districts, metropolitan planning districts or planning councils that would have legal powers to control development. I think it'd be difficult to implement these kinds of things, but I think it's important to debate and discuss them because we recognize that the problems of Kansas City or any other inner city community, those problems are not rooted just in the actions of what's happening in Kansas City. They have a metropolitan basis to them. And we all are, we're residents of urban communities. We're also residents of metropolitan communities too. And I think embracing a more supra level of analysis, a supra-urban level of analysis, focusing on the metropolitan level would be important. And it could help address these urban problems that are not just rooted in the actions of what's happening in the urban community, but are really rooted in metropolitan-wide processes and patterns of uneven development. We could also address things such as incentivizing people to live in racially mixed and class mixed neighborhoods, addressing the housing voucher system, providing housing vouchers to people not to relocate just in poor neighborhoods, but giving them information so that they can make informed decisions about where they might want to live in other areas of the metropolitan level, metropolitan area, which means giving them the opportunity to move not just within Kansas City, Missouri or Kansas City, Kansas, but also across those boundaries into other areas. So those factors, focusing on the metropolitan level, reforming the housing voucher system, embracing subsidies or incentives to encourage people to live in class and racially mixed neighborhoods. Those are some factors that we could debate and discuss and maybe implement to address some of the inequalities that we face in our cities and metropolitan areas. Yeah, so how would we address the metropolitan fragmentation of different jurisdictions in a metropolitan area to have metropolitan-wide comprehensive policies? It's a tremendous challenge. Other cities have experimented with it. I think we have a unique challenge in Kansas City because of the state line that bisects the metropolitan area. We have hundreds of municipalities and governments in both the Kansas side and the Missouri side of the state line in our Kansas City metropolitan area. Ultimately, embracing, formulating, and implementing metropolitan-wide solutions with respect to housing, schools, and so on, you'd have to get the buy-in from the different jurisdictions. And that would mean, I think, a long process of debate and discussion of the different constituencies in the metropolitan area. It had to be people that represent the school districts. It had to be people that represent neighborhoods. It might be a large number of people that have to be brought to the table. But it'd also be a great opportunity to engage in a metropolitan-wide discussion, even if the policies may not be implemented on focusing on housing authorities or school districts. It would be a wonderful, I think, opportunity to engage people on a metropolitan level and I think inform them that the problems they're dealing with both in their inner city community, but also problems they may be dealing with in their affluent suburban community, these problems are rooted in metropolitan processes and patterns of development, that they're not just rooted in the everyday activities of what's happening in their community. Yeah, there's a number of aspects that affect us, and across state lines. That we cross state lines, we cross school district lines, we cross city boundary lines all the time. We use the resources that different cities have, even though we may not be a resident of that city. I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas. I came over to Kansas City, Missouri all the time for things. And I worked in different parts of the metropolitan area too. We've actually seen examples of metropolitan initiatives that people have supported. For example, years ago there was support for a bi-state tax to help fund the rebuilding of Union Station. There's been talk of using tax money to help upkeep the Royals and Chiefs Stadium. Okay, so these metropolitan-wide initiatives are being discussed and debated. I think they should be discussed and debated when it comes to remedying social inequalities with respect to schools and housing.